Hello there! Welcome to a new series here on my channel where I'll be sharing my advice and tips for making art. I hope these videos will help any artist, whether you've been drawing for years or brand new to the craft. With this first video, I'll be covering one of my favorite elements in visual art: value and color. If you've seen any of my art, like, ever, you know damn well that I love color. Heck, the reason I don't offer any line art only or sketch only commissions is because coloring and rendering is my favorite part of the art process. Even though color is so prevalent in our lives, it can also be a daunting part of learning visual art. I see many artists, even experienced ones, express their nervousness when it comes to picking colors and figuring out how to use them. If you're not sure how to use colors the way you want, or you just want to learn, then this video is for you. The anatomy of color. Instead of tackling everything all at once like one big lump, let's break color into its core parts. Let's talk about the anatomy of color. Any given color is basically made up of three parts: value, saturation, and hue. Value describes how light or dark a color is. When it comes to the readability of an image, value usually matters more than any of these other factors. It helps define light and shadow, and produces contrast. Generally, you'll hear me use the terms dark, mid, and light tones throughout this video. Value is actually a pretty in-depth topic on its own, and if you're interested, I'll gladly make a video about it. Comment if that's something you'd like to see. Saturation is how much of a color is present in the color. That phrasing is pretty awkward. It's easier to imagine when you think of it in terms of paint. Let's say I've got two paints, titanium white and naphthol red. Out of the tube, naphthol red is very saturated. It's got a very strong concentration of redness. Titanium white is the opposite. It has no obvious single color, and is essentially just a value with nothing else. If you mix these together, you'll get something more in the middle. Saturation, in this case, just tells us how much or how little there is of naphthol red in the mixture. We can apply this idea to other colors in other contexts, like digital art, printing, and more. Hue tells you exactly what color a color is. That's another awkward phrase. How about this? Hue tells you where a color lands on the color wheel. Is it blue, red, yellow? This is what hue is all about. What color are we even looking at? That's hue. It might be the easiest aspect of color to understand, at least in my opinion. A color wheel is a tool that we can use to describe hues, and how similar or different they are from each other. You can think of these three elements of color as dimensions. Heck, some color pickers will even use them as sliders. Tweak these variables, and the resulting color will change. Each dimension has a different impact on this, and they're worth experimenting with. Color is a lot easier to understand when you know how it's built, and you have the vocabulary to describe what you're looking at. The anatomy of color seriously helps. How do we perceive color? Another important aspect of color that's good to know about is how we, as humans, even perceive color. If you have at least some understanding of how color is perceived, you could exploit these properties to make your palettes more compelling in your art. Humans have two different parts of the eye that help perceive color. First is the rods. These are the parts of the eye that see value, that is, light and shadow. The second is the cones. These are the parts of the eye that see saturation and hue. Cones are only really active when they have sufficient light. In dim lighting, your eyes only use the rods. Next time you're in a dimly lit environment, take a look around and notice that your vision may just be in grayscale. That means that darker environments tend to look less saturated than brightly lit ones. Usually, humans have three cones that detect three wavelengths of light, in blue, green, and red. Color blindness occurs when someone is missing one or more of these types of cones. The three cone colors combine to create every other color we see. For example, red and green light combine to show us yellow, blue and red show us magenta, and green and blue combine for cyan. This way of combining colors, using light to go directly into the eye, is called additive mixing. That means we are adding light. Of course, there is another more well-known way of mixing colors. Let's go back to paint for a second. As a kid, you might have been taught that mixing colors goes like this. Red and yellow make orange, blue and yellow make green, red and blue make purple. Upon hearing about additive mixing, you might be confused. Is this other mixing still true? Yes, it's just called something different. This is called subtractive mixing. Mixing paint mixes the materials together, increasing the amount of light they absorb, and therefore subtracting the light they reflect. This is why mixing paints works differently than mixing lights. This is also where we get our terms for additive and subtractive mixing. It might sound confusing, but I promise it's not too hard. Just know that the way colors mix and behave might be different depending on the materials you use. The last point I need to make when it comes to the human perception of color is this. Colors never, ever exist in isolation. Colors exist only with context. Even showing you a red square still has context because here it's surrounded by a dark background. The way we perceive color is always totally influenced by the context we see it in. The way your brain processes color is very different from the literal hues and values a color actually has if you were to directly analyze it. Let's use some pictures of my late dog as an example. Most people would say that Charlie here is a white dog. Of course he is. He's a Westie. They're famous for their white fur. And their sassy attitude, but that's beside the point. However, in various pictures, if I were to go in and actually color pick the, quote, real color of his fur, it's not pure white like how we conceptualize it in our heads. In some lighting, he looks more cream-colored, or maybe even a little purple. However, thanks to the context of the rest of these pictures, we still understand his coat to be white. The term we use for the true color a thing has is local colors. This is the way we assume something might look in totally neutral daylight. Charlie is white. Pikachu is yellow. My mascot, Zothman, is blue. When you say something is a color, you're usually talking about the local colors. You could, of course, use local colors for everything. However, you might find that your lighting is a little lackluster, and there's no diversity to the lighting situations for your subjects. Exploiting contextual color is how we can force a viewer to see local colors, but get all the benefits of a more unique and expressive color palette. One of my favorite examples of situational and contextual light in art is through Cucumber Quest, a lovely webcomic by GGDG. The main character, Cucumber, has local colors, sure, but we basically never get to see them. The comic is dominated by beautiful color palettes, and GGDG illustrates their characters in this beautiful light. It helps to capture the mood of each environment Cucumber finds himself in, and gosh, it's really just beautiful to look at. Seriously, go follow GGDG, read their visual novel Soul of Sovereignty, and read Cucumber Quest 2. Their use of color in all their projects is just exemplary. Here's the bottom line. Don't be limited by what you think something looks like when making art. This is especially true for colors. Colors are extremely contextual. Colors are extremely flexible. If you can get past the fear of making colors look wrong, your ability to use colors will be unstoppable. A quick course on color palettes. Alright, here's the fun part. It's all well and good to know the concepts of how to approach color and how we see it, but I'm sure you've been waiting for me to actually go over the real shit people talk about when it comes to color theory. The palettes! It's one thing to study singular colors, but as you know, colors are never in isolation. They're always in the context of a wider palette. I'll provide examples from various popular art, Unsplash photos, and some of my own work. Let's get into some color palettes and see how they work. As I go over each type of palette, I'll be giving my thoughts on their effects. However, I want you to also think about what you feel when you see these color palettes. It's one thing just to follow what someone else says something feels like, but you'll be better off in the long run if you can articulate how these different palettes feel to you specifically. What vibes do they have? Do you like them? Do you prefer one over the other? If so, which ones? These are the kinds of questions that I want you to think to yourself when you're looking at color palettes and studying how they work. Low, high, and mid keys. Before I get into actual chromatic colors, I want to quickly touch on the general value families that most images can be sorted into. These are low, high, and mid key palettes. A low key color palette is one that is predominantly dark, with so-called low values. A low key image often feels mysterious and dramatic and leans into the darkness. As highly visual animals, us humans find darkness to be compelling and scary at the same time. We want to know what is in the dark, yet we also fear what it could be. Many pieces of low-key imagery utilize this element, taking advantage of the darkness to create simple yet dramatic compositions. Some low-key images take another approach, something that embraces the calm and quiet of nighttime. After all, as diurnal animals, we think of the night as being a quiet, perhaps even relaxing time. In this way, low-key palettes can represent two extremes of either caution and danger, or peace and quiet. A high-key color palette is the opposite, a color palette that is predominantly bright. Many pastel palettes would probably fall into this category. While few bright accents stand out starkly against a dark background, I find that this effect is a bit less powerful with dark accents on light backgrounds. That might just be me though, you might find that you think darkness is way more dramatic. Overall, I find high-key images to have less strong overall contrast and drama compared to their low-key counterparts. A high-key image also evokes the idea of bright, harsh sunlight. It's rare that we see an environment in our lives that is so bright as to be almost totally white. So an image that looks like this gives the idea of a bright flash, at least to me. In a way, this brightness can be blinding in a similar way that the darkness in low-key images can be mysterious. You can hide details in bright light just like how you can in deep darkness. It's always fun to compare low and high-key images and see how they are both quite similar and totally different. In the middle, you have a mid-key image. You'll almost never hear anyone say the phrase mid-key because, in a way, it basically applies to almost every palette that isn't just mostly dark or mostly light. However, I do think that an artist mid-key palette can exist. A palette that is predominantly made up of middle-toned colors. These often have a gentle, softer feel. The mid-tones lend themselves to less contrast, and are overall just easy on the eyes. It can be hard to find an image that is properly in the mid-key as I've described it, but they do have this distinctive feel to them. It's rare that you're in a lighting situation that truly feels mostly middling in its colors. It's calm, it's relaxed, but it's also a little weird. I suppose in some ways the classic backrooms hallways can fall into a mid-key where it lacks the harshness of actually bright sunlight, but it also usually lacks deep shadows, at least in most of the images anyway. There's just something paradoxical about a true mid-key palette that I find kind of interesting. These keys can be used to describe lots of other color palettes. After all, the keys really dig into the values of an image or palette, and that's something that can occur with any set of hues. Seeing how the keys and the palettes play together is one of my favorite things about working with colors. Greyscale. While a grayscale palette may lack true color, that is to say it has no saturation and no hues, it's still a valuable type of palette to think about. True grayscale palettes are totally devoid of those dimensions, but it's certainly possible to use warm or cool grays, shades of gray with just a hint of a warm or cool color. For example, many walls in most rented apartments near me rarely use an actual pure white. They usually use some sort of off-white. If you live somewhere with white walls, take a look at them and see if you can tell if it's a cool or a warm tone. A grayscale palette often looks quite stark and lends itself well to high contrast. Since value is the focus of a palette like this, grayscale palettes are also a valuable tool for learning. Grayscale allows you to fully embrace the feelings of the various keys, and reduces the variables to worry about when you're learning. It's harder to be indecisive when there are simply fewer decisions to make. When I was in college and I took a full semester on color, we spent the first 7 weeks on grayscale and values alone, and for good reason. If you want to study grayscale art, there is certainly quite a lot to look at. Though, personally, I love using manga as a great way to study how to effectively use grayscale palettes. After all, most manga is printed as just black and white, so the artists have to come up with compelling ways to use this limitation to its fullest. Whatever format you find it, take time to study grayscale palettes. They really do have a lot to teach you, and you can use those lessons when working with fuller colors. Monochromatic. I actually think it's harder to find a truly monochromatic image than it is to find a grayscale one. A monochromatic palette is a palette that only uses one hue. However, I'd also go ahead and let this tag apply to hues that are super close to each other on the color wheel, the kinds of palettes where the hue difference is so subtle you'd almost never notice it. When I work with monochromatic palettes, this sort of tiny hue shift is what I do, and it just gives the images a tiny bit more life. Monochromatic palettes are stark, and often strongly lean into whatever key they fall into. They often lack the full drama of a high-contrast grayscale palette, often because the color that's present takes away from the bite of the contrast. However, there are definitely examples of truly dramatic monochromatic palettes. You just aren't likely to see this type of palette very often. It's rare for a designer to stick to one hue and one hue only. Monochrome comes off as a little unnatural, since there are very few things and environments we see in nature that actually look this way. Monochrome images feel like they have a filter over them because of how uncommon natural monochromaticism is. My personal favorite monochromatic palettes are one that utilize a pure black and a pure white, in addition to grays added with the hue. Actually, I think my favorite use of monochromatic palettes is just black, white, and a saturated accent color. I like high contrast, and this use of monochromaticism gets all the drama of a grayscale palette without losing the personality that comes from including a color. That's my take anyway. Analogous. An analogous palette is a color palette with hues that are all close to each other on the color wheel. Not close enough to be considered monochromatic, but still close enough to be neighbors. It's not a hard line. Everyone's visual discernment between analogous and monochrome palettes will probably vary quite a lot. Due to the proximity of the colors, analogous images often have a harmonious feel to them. I personally find that analogous palettes with very close colors have a visual harmony that you can sometimes see in monochromatic images, but they don't feel quite as flat or artificial. After all, analogous colors are common to see together in nature. Anytime you experience an environment with a strongly colored light source, you're probably seeing lots of analogous colors all together. Generally, most analogous palettes can be grouped as either warm palettes or cool palettes. This is kinda self-explanatory. Warm palettes usually feature several consecutive warm colors, and cool palettes feature several consecutive cool colors. A warm palette often evokes, well, a warm feeling. We associate these colors with the sun and fire. It often feels like you're at a bonfire or at sunset. Cool palettes often evoke a darker feel, since the natural value of pure violet or pure blue tends to be darker than pure yellow or pure orange. They feel like they're in or near water or at night, both environments that we associate with feeling cooler. Of course, not every analogous palette fits neatly into this binary. After all, for example, you could have a palette of yellow, green, and blue. However, I do find that it's still useful to notice when an analogous palette leans more warm, more cool, or is somewhere in the middle, since these hue families can have different impressions. Working with analogous palettes forces you to pay attention to relative color temperature. It's one thing to know that blue is cool and red is warm, but what about the coolness and warmness between different shades of red? Analogous palettes place these colors near each other and allow you to directly observe how these small differences give these colors different uses in different contexts. Noticing the relationships and differences between colors that are similar will help build up your intuition for using them. Place different colors in different locations on a single piece and experiment with how the piece changes. You'd be surprised with how much variation and contrast you can pull out of a palette that seems simple, but is full of life and potential. Complementary. When I was a kid learning about colors in school, this was one of the very first palettes I was taught about. A complementary color palette is built from colors that are opposite to each other on the color wheel. This means their hues are highly contrasting. The most classic known complementary palettes are red and green, blue and orange, and yellow and violet. However, there are millions of other complementary pairs. Play with sliding around on a color wheel and check out all the different pairs it can offer. A complementary palette is inherently full of contrast and tension, and they can feel tremendously dramatic. Many movie posters use complementary palettes because of their high readability and how eye-catching the contrast between the hues can be. Blue and orange are especially popular for this use. The ratio of the colors matters quite a lot when it comes to a complementary palette too. Does the palette favor one color over the other, or are they evenly distributed? How would an image change if you traded places between the complementary colors? These questions will help you understand how complementary palettes work, and build the intuition you need to use them with ease. Another interesting note about complementary colors is that they have a unique quirk when mixed. Because complementary colors are opposite hues, they make a pure middle gray when mixed together. Well, at least in theory. In practice, some natural pigments are just stronger than others. If you're ever mixing paint and you want to cut down the saturation of a color, just add a little bit of its complement. This also has the interesting effect of a pure mid-tone gray looking like a complementary color when surrounded by something saturated. Pure gray looks green next to a bright red. The lack of red just makes you want to start perceiving the opposite hue even when it's absent. You can actually generate the effect of a complementary palette without actually using its saturated complement by just utilizing some well-placed grays. Using the grays instead can help reduce the harshness and the contrast, so I find that this technique works well for parts of an image that aren't a focal point, something that I would want to take a back seat to when compared to the main subject of an illustration. There's quite a lot you can do with the relationship between gray and two complements, so go crazy and experiment. Split complementary. Want the drama of a complementary palette, but the harmony of an analogous palette? That's what split complementary is all about. Split complementary is actually my personal favorite type of color palette. A split complementary palette includes a complementary pair, plus the analogous colors for one of the members. For example, you could use orange and blue as the base complements, and then include something like teal and indigo to make it a split complement. Some folks will say that a true split complement actually doesn't have the actual pair color, so in this example it would just have teal and indigo without blue. However, I think the distinction isn't that important, so I'm grouping these together as one big split complementary family. Like I mentioned, a split complementary palette gains benefits from both analogous and complementary palettes. You gain the subtleties of relative color temperature and hue variation from the analogous group, and then you can use the complementary color on the other side for emphasis and drama. It loses a bit of the bite from a true complementary palette, and it isn't quite as smooth and harmonious as a pure analogous palette. However, I think that's totally fine. The benefits of pairing complementary contrast and analogous harmony easily outweigh any loss of the palettes on their own, at least for me. A split complementary palette is also useful as an artist because it comes with a built-in suggested use ratio for the colors it contains. Use the analogous group for the majority of an image, and then use the complement as an accent. That's usually how I end up using these sorts of palettes anyway. That's not a hard rule though. You can definitely make an image that is predominantly one hue with a small portion dedicated to an analogous complement. If you want to start getting more adventurous with color palettes, split complementary is my favorite to recommend. Triadic. A triadic color palette is built from hues that are all equidistant from each other on the color wheel. That means that when connected, they make an equilateral triangle. The most classic example of a triadic palette is the primary colors red, blue, and yellow. And of course, there's the secondary colors in orange, green, and violet. There's this interesting contrast generated by colors that are all equally distant from each other. They're not close enough to be as harmonious as an analogous palette, but they lack the bite and drama of a complementary palette. It ends up sitting somewhere in the middle. I find that triadic palettes tend to be a little unintuitive to use most of the time, mainly because I find it easier to visualize the relationship between a complementary pair than between three triadic colors. To me, there's just something playful about a triadic palette. Maybe it's just because the most common uses for a strong triadic palette are toys and media for children, but I do think that the not too intense hue contrast between the colors allows them to feel adventurous without feeling harsh, and that's what gives them that playful feel. I find that in most examples I can discern, triadic images tend to use the colors somewhat evenly throughout. Maybe this helps emphasize the harmony and multifacetedness that the palette inherently lends itself to. However, I think there's still a lot to be explored in using one color as the dominant and the other two as accents, or building an environment out of two colors and using the third as a subject. It's a bit harder to pigeonhole or quantify triadic palettes because they're inherently more complicated just by having more hues, but I do think that this playfulness is their defining characteristic. Tetradic. If a triadic color palette is built from a triangle, a tetradic palette is built from a square. You can also describe a tetradic palette as having two complementary pairs that are 90 degrees away from each other. Unlike the equal contrast between all of Triadic's trio, a tetradic palette's colors are not all equally distant from each other. Each color has a counterpart that is further away from it than the other two are. If a triadic palette is hard to find and pick out, so is a tetradic palette. I have trouble intuitively using this palette for the same reasons too. I just don't find it terribly intuitive. Working with so many different hues is also simply more challenging. You just have more decisions to make when it comes to the relationship between each color, and the interactions between the two composite complementary pairs can get pretty complicated. A tetradic palette is a palette that screams multicolor to me. It's a palette that's truly about having many hues. Interestingly, despite having two high contrast pairs, a tetradic palette doesn't feel as dramatic as a lone complementary pair. The fact that the pairs are evenly matched gives this palette a sense of stability and harmony, as opposed to the conflict that just one pair creates. These palettes also tend to feel fairly natural to me, perhaps because of that visual stability and the fact that in real life you're just more likely to see lots of hues at the same time in most environments. It doesn't have a punch like Complementary, and it doesn't feel as adventurous and playful as Triadic. To me, tetradic colors are about equal harmony between several disparate elements. How to study color. After this video is over, I recommend taking time to go out there and actually study some color palettes on your own. After all, it's hard to retain information if you don't put it to use. An easy exercise to do if you have an image editor on your computer is to just color pick notable colors in an image, then take a look at how they relate to each other on a color wheel. Can you pick out a specific palette type from those samples? This exercise will also hold your hand through training your eyes to notice actual color versus perceived color. After a few sessions and studies using an actual color picker, try doing this just in your head, if possible. See if you can pick out what color a color is just by taking a close look at it. And see if you can pick out color palettes just by taking a look at how they are together. This might not be something everyone can do, but I think it's worth giving a try. Another exercise is to start paying attention to the keys of images, noticing if they're high, low, or mid-key. While not every image will hit one of these labels cleanly, using similar vocabulary for similar images will allow you to notice trends and similarities between them. Observing these color palettes in practice will build up your visual library for how they work, and build up your intuition for using them in your own work. And this is less of a specific exercise, but more of a mindset to bring with you out into the world. Start paying attention to the colors around you in real life. No matter how boring an object or environment may be, it probably has colors. Practice noticing them and see how they interact with each other. Sometimes you'll get a really swell analogous palette looking at some pretty clouds. Or you might see a cool high contrast palette in someone's outfit. Maybe a meme you saw online has a deceptively compelling color palette. Start being mindful and noticing these things in your life. Even if it's only a tiny bit of effort, it really does add up over time. And this passive intake of knowledge will give you a stronger sense of how color works. Color sense and intuition isn't something someone else can do for you. Making color easier on yourself really is something that has to come from your own experience. That doesn't mean you have to do 1,000 color drawings to learn, though I'm sure that would still help. It just means that you have to discover for yourself how you perceive colors. No one knows how palettes make you feel except yourself. No one can pick out a favorite color for you. No one can decide your favorite color palettes to work with. Only you can do that. So I encourage you to take notes of your own personal thoughts on the various elements of colors. All art is highly personal. Learning about color is no different. Embrace the subjectivity of color perception and discover what you do or don't like for yourself. Lastly, I encourage you. Try not to be intimidated by all this information. Color is a deceptively deep subject, but that doesn't mean it has to be difficult. Studying color comes in many layers. After all, there's a reason they were teaching me and my classmates some of the very basics when we were in kindergarten. Even if color has a lot of complicated terminology and such, it still has earlier layers to make it more approachable. The fact that color has so many layers is why I've got different chapters in this video. If you're a little overwhelmed by one part, you can always just come back and watch it again later once you've learned more about the earlier layers. Even if color does have a lot of complicated terminology and such, it still has these earlier layers that make it more approachable. Color is flexible. It's easy to start small, and once you're ready, it has all the depth you could ever want to study. And with that, I think that's all I will cover for color for now. Even though I feel like I've talked about it so much, I also feel like there's still so much more I want to talk about. I could really make a whole video about values, or a video about each type of palette all on their own. Like I said, color is deceptively deep to talk about. I love colors, I love working with them, I love studying them. I can only hope that I can impart at least a little bit of that enthusiasm onto all of you watching. My hope is that this video can make color a little bit more approachable, whether you're a beginning artist, a veteran brushing up on the basics, or someone who's just curious about this part of the visual world. Let me know if there are any other specific art topics you'd like me to cover in the future. I plan on making this a recurring series on the channel. In the future, I'd like to cover the elements of design, rendering, composition, shape language, and more. If there's something you want to hear my thoughts on, let me know, and I might make a video about it. Thank you so much for watching this first part of the series, and I hope to have another part here for you all soon. Thank you to my Ko-fi members for helping to make this video possible. My Ko-fi members make my life and income a little more stable, and help me live my dream of being a full-time artist. I'm in the process of moving at the time of writing this, and the extra bit of help I get from my Ko-fi members really does make a difference. If you'd like to join them, you can check out my Ko-fi page in the description, where you can join as a member for as little as just $1 a month. I'm hoping to reach 100 monthly members before the end of 2026, so every member, no matter how small, counts. I'm also intending on making some members-only zines going over each of the topics in these videos in a nice readable format. I think that'd be a nice way to thank the folks supporting the channel. If you're interested in helping me reach that membership goal, or getting any of the other benefits, go check out my Ko-fi linked in the description. Since I'm moving, I'm also having a big sale over on my VGen page. All shop items and most commissions are now 10% off, So if you'd like to get some cool art and also help me with the process of moving, consider supporting me over on VGen. I have a fairly quick turnaround time, so if you have a tight deadline, I can totally work under that. I'd love to work together, so reach out if you'd like to get some art done. While I was in the process of editing this video, I actually became an affiliate with Clip Studio Paint. Clip Studio Paint is my favorite digital art drawing software by far. I just really love this thing. It's what I use to record my time lapses and do basically every speed paint in all of my videos. So if you're interested, I have an affiliate link below where I can get a small commission. So if you're interested in getting Clip Studio Paint and trying it out for yourself, go check out the link below or use this QR code. It would help support the channel, and it's a pretty nice software that I personally recommend. With that, I believe that's all I've got for this video. Thank you all again so much for watching. I really hope this video helps anyone who wants to make something. I'll see you all again next week with another video. In the meantime, why don't you guys go out there and make some art?